I'm Connie Vanita Dow, Dean of Libraries at Vanderbilt, and I'm so pleased to see this wonderful crowd this evening for one of our most special events. I first want to welcome you to our community room. It's a room that's mostly used for study by our students, but it was originally conceived to be a room just for this purpose, to welcome folks from the Vanderbilt community and the surrounding areas to the wonderful programs that we have an opportunity to host here at Vanderbilt. I first want to give my deep thanks to the two gentlemen here. This program, Seigenthaler ×2, The Changing Face of the News, has been a dream that I've hoped to work through several busy schedules to make happen, and that Michael Seigenthaler, who's the gentleman closest to me here, changed his schedule, took a day off. You know, he's supposed to be doing something else really important now. And I think it was the other gentleman's persuasive powers and a lady in the audience who
It was yours.
But we are so honored, and I can't wait to see this program. I've asked our Chair of Political Science, John Seigenthaler, who's also co-chairing the Vanderbilt-wide strategic planning and who just happens to be a really great guy, to introduce our speakers today. You may know him from all the quotes in the newspapers about the Vanderbilt poll. He's also often advises Impact, one of our favorite things here at Vanderbilt, where we bring political speakers together about issues of the day. And I want to thank John for doing this, and I'll turn the mic over to him now.
Well, when Connie asked me to do this, it was over email, and it was later in the evening, and I think Beth and I had a second glass of wine, and I easily agreed to it. But as I thought about it, this is actually a pretty massive task, because I don't want to just introduce these gentlemen and list out their very numerous and extensive accomplishments. It has to be more than that. We all know what these two gentlemen have accomplished, but I thought about it, and I agree with Connie completely, that this particular program is an amazing one for a variety of reasons, and I thought I'd rather set that context than list through all their accomplishments, most of which you already know about. And in some ways, I'll be doing things that are obvious, but I think it's still worth it to start this conversation. The first is that the news media itself, and we're talking about the changing face of the news, it changed at such breakneck speed. You think about the fact just a few years ago, a few decades ago, however you want to measure it, we're talking about the 3 major networks and a few major newspapers that were driving the news process. That's completely broken down. We have 24/7 news coverage of all different sorts. We have now a tremendous proliferation of all kinds of news sources, whether it be CNN, Al Jazeera, or whatever these opportunities or these new venues are. It is just amazing, and the change continues. I have people after me trying to get on Twitter, and I don't want to be on Twitter because I figure it's only about a year long and it'll be something else down the road, and I just prefer to be on the dull edge at all times. I pride myself on that. The second reason why this is a great program is that we have a huge amount of experience here. In fact, I did a back of the envelope calculation. We have over 100 years experience here in journalism, which I don't want to tell you who is in fact more responsible for those numbers. But it is a massive amount of experience. But more importantly than the experience is that these two gentlemen have been leaders in their field. They have taken risks. They have done things that others wouldn't necessarily have done. But they did it because they understood where the news was going. They understood that certain topics had to be covered in the 1960s that didn't want to be covered by lots of people here in the South. Others understood that the news was going to take on more of an international face, and it wasn't just going to be about national politics, and it wasn't just going to be nationally located, that it was going to have an international flavor. That these two men understood that and were true leaders. So we're not just talking about experience, but we're talking about cutting-edge experience. And the final thing, and I'll just leave it at this and then move on to these conversations, is that we get to be privy to a conversation between two people who just don't know each other. They're father and son, and they have a bond that can't possibly be described, but we are going to be able to watch that interaction in a way that makes this conversation all the more special. And so I will now turn it over to John Seigenthaler Sr. and John Seigenthaler Jr., and please give them a warm Vanderbilt welcome.
That's the best introduction we've ever had.
Oh, the best we've ever had, John. I want to thank John for the best. It's wonderful to have you say those nice things about the two of us, and it's so great to be here and to have you providing the introductions. And Connie, thank you so much for having us and inviting us to participate tonight. I guess I'll begin. You know, I never once in my life encouraged my son to go into to journalism. Looking back on it, Dolores is sitting right there, and she can attest to this being true. There were times when she suggested it, but I thought, you know, he really might want to do something else, and if I influence that decision, it might be the wrong thing to do, and I might be robbing some other profession. I'll be robbing him of a.
They wanted me to go to law school. It didn't work out.
No, that's right. He got tied up with some television journalists on a national political campaign, and that was the end of it. He came home with stars in his eyes, and Dolores said, "You see, I told you what you should have done." And of course, she was right. That's where he belonged, and I would have to say, looking back on it, and having watched him so closely all these years, he's the best journalist I know. I say that as a father. You know, I say it as a father, but I say it as a critic of journalists, an admirer of journalists, and a critic of journalists. And this transition that's taken place from my life to his life, I mean, journalism across generations is really what it's about for all of us now. Today it's all online, except every night at 8 and 11 in New York and 7 and 10 here, it's 107 Al Jazeera, A-Jam. And you know, I'm really proud.
He doesn't encourage me, but he promotes me very well.
And I'm so proud that you could come and that Connie asked you. And
Well, I am, as many of you know, and this is a terrific crowd and lots of friends here tonight, and I want to thank all of you for coming out. I'm so proud to be with my father, and proud that I am also named John Seigenthaler. Never prouder than I am tonight with you talking about this. There is so much journalism talent in this room, and it's not just at this end of the room. I mean, Jack Korn and Jim Squires and Frank Empson, and there may be others here who worked with my father at the Tennessean. It makes that the number of years go up substantially. I thought I would start, before we get too deep into it, to tell a quick story. And it's really about politics and communication and journalism. In the 1950s, there's a story about politics that Gordon Browning was running for re-election in the state of Tennessee for governor. And he decided that he was going to launch his campaign early and do it in East Tennessee. And so he asked a young reporter to travel with him and cover his appearance in East Tennessee. As many of you know, East Tennessee is a big Republican area, and Gordon Browning was a Democrat, but he decided he was going to make that trip to East Tennessee. And so the reporter and the governor got in the car, and they made their way to Mountain City. Now, Mountain City is up a very long two-lane highway that winds back and forth. Very dangerous, very scary, and finally they wound their way up to the top, and there were a few people gathered at the courthouse, few Republicans who politely welcomed the governor, and the governor got out and he stepped up on the stump and he made his speech, and at the end of the speech he had one last thing to say, and he says, I'm going to tell the people of Mountain City one thing. I want to promise you this, that the next time I come to Mountain City, there's going to be a brand new 4-lane highway all the way from the bottom up to the top. And they cheered, and the governor stepped down, and the reporter got back into the car with the governor. And they started driving down the mountain, and the reporter turned to the governor and said, Governor, do you know what you did? You just promised a multi-million-dollar highway to those people. How are you going to deliver on that? And he said, son, if you're going to be a reporter, if you're going to learn to be a good reporter, you're going to have to listen better. I said, the next time I come to Mountain City. He said, I don't plan to ever come to Mountain City again. That reporter was the John Seigenthaler. It is true that my father didn't encourage me, but by living in his house, you couldn't avoid the excitement and the thrill of what journalism was all about. Every night, he would come home and we'd talk about what would be on the front page the next morning. What photograph that Jack Korn or Frank Empson took would be the front page, on the front page. What story that had been written would be on the front page and why it was there. I had a schooling in journalism long before I went to college. I never went to journalism school, but I felt I had already been to journalism school. And I was not sure what I was going to do, but I ended up going into television news. We thought we'd talk in the beginning a little bit about the state of journalism in America today. And I think that, I had left journalism, or journalism had left me 6 years ago, when I left NBC News. And I went to work with my cousins at Seigenthaler Public Relations here in Nashville. I really felt that journalism was in a decline in many ways. The focus on celebrity, the focus on the sensational, on the lowest common denominator, what I would describe as heat more than light, fiery, food-throwing conversations on television that drove people apart instead of provided information. So when I was asked to consider an opportunity to work for Al Jazeera, and it is interesting. I sometimes will say, people will ask me, well, what do you do? And I say, well, I work for Al Jazeera America. Pause. Pause. Long pause. And of course, there are a lot of people who have a difficulty saying it. I mean, Al Jazeera, my mom still can't quite get the name of it. But when they approached me about it, now, to be brief, they said, look, our focus is doing serious news. That's all our focus is. In-depth, unbiased, fact-based journalism. Our focus is not on ratings. Our focus is on doing the best job we can to deliver news to the United States, and we have resources to do it, and we're going to open 12 bureaus in the United States, and we have 70 bureaus around the world, and we're going to be in 55 million homes to begin with. That's a good start, and we're going to expand. And they offered me the opportunity to do their 2 primetime newscasts, and I said yes. So I have new hope in journalism as we speak today. So let me talk to me about what your vision of the state, the state of the media is.
until I started watching 107 every night, I was saying the future of journalism is all online. And that's not far off the mark. Al Jazeera is also online. The last thing you do every night before you go off at, we get at 7:10, but the last thing you say is, meanwhile, you get all the news online at Al Jazeera America. And but the interesting thing is that every news organization is now that's now looking at the future is looking at a future that is online. And as I evaluate it and think about it, it seems to me that the new technology has adversely affected print journalism far more than it has television news. I may be wrong about that. We haven't talked about it.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, there's a recent poll that suggests that people get most of their news, still get most of their news from local news channels or from the cable news channels. And I think you pointed this story out to me this morning on the airplane down in the New York Times. If you looked at the business section on the front page, there's a story about how journalists may get paid by the click when it comes to their stories. I mean, as we all know, newspapers have had a declining revenue because people they get it online, and often they get it for free, with the exception of some newspapers, like now the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and the Tennessean. But they're trying to figure out a way to pay to provide news. I don't know whether this is going to work, but if you look at, there were several stories in that business section today that all related to journalism online, how to make it work, anonymous journalism online. They talked about Gawker and BuzzFeed. And by the way, anybody read? How many of you read BuzzFeed or Gawker? Okay, so it's not big in this crowd because BuzzFeed and Gawker are very much talked about in journalism circles today. A lot of it is anonymous. Some of it isn't, but it's a new form of journalism. It's a viral form of journalism. Sometimes it's totally wrong and made up, and that's the scary part about the new world of our new online world of journalism today.
It is indeed.
How did it change? How has it changed from when you covered stories on the police beat to today? How a story about a crime that was committed in Nashville was related to the community through the newspaper to the way it is today?
Well, I mean, somebody who used to work for the Banner had something to do with that. When I was a police reporter, I didn't check in the office first every afternoon. I checked in at the police department. And before the night was over, I was at the police department, and then which was down on 2nd Avenue, and then I'd walk up to the courthouse where the county sheriff's office was. And when the news broke, I was in the car listening to the radio. The news story was breaking, and whether it was a robbery of a liquor store or an automobile accident where it appeared somebody had been killed, or a burglary or a robbery at someone's home, I was in the car and out to cover it. And I don't know that I know their beats are so few and far between now. I think that reporting on institutions has diminished significantly, and I think the reader is the poorer for it.
So there used to be a police reporter. How well was the legislature covered?
Well, the House, we had a reporter on the House, a reporter on the Senate, and a political reporter that roamed. So you had 3 members of the legislature.
From your newspaper.
Absolutely,
And then the
from our
banner.
paper. And at the legislature, you also had at least one reporter from Knoxville, one from Chattanooga, one from Memphis, and sometimes one from Jackson and Oak Ridge. So, it was
Substantial
pretty massive
legislative
cover, yeah.
And by the time the 80s, when I got into television, the 80s hit, we had not only those people that you described, but also reporters from all the television stations, many radio stations, statewide networks. So there were a substantial number of journalists covering what was going on every day at the legislature while it was in session. It doesn't exist today. And the same thing for federal court. I mean, we made regular rounds to federal court, and until recently, because of one of the things you did and got involved in, federal courts weren't being covered at all.
And now we have a close-knit group of about half dozen. A Vanderbilt graduate, Wendell Rawls, edits them, and they are all journalism students at Murfreesboro, and they come in and cover the federal courts every day, and Rawls oversees their reporting, and they've been at it now for 3 semesters, and it's been error-free, which is remarkable, by the way,
Right.
given the timeline and the pressures of deadline and the amount of news. And of course, when I was editor at Tennessean, or when I was a reporter for Tennessean, there was one reporter who covered the federal courts, and now it's not just the courts themselves, but I would drop by when I was covering the federal courts. I'd drop by the office of the FBI. I'd drop by the U.S. Marshal's office. I'd drop by the Federal District Attorney's office. Now there's one to go around for every office up there. So it's made a difference. But I think it's inevitable. It is inevitable, I think, as a younger generation realizes the opportunity to get news online, that readership is going to increase, and as readers began to chase that news online, I think the future is going to be that advertisers will chase those readers, and the result of it, it'll never be the cash cow that it once was when I was in it, but it's going to be a meaningful change for the better, and you're going to see, I think, reporters. You're going to see more reporters again covering more beats, and that means that institutional journalism is not dead forever. I think there's going to be a revitalization of it.
I hope you're right. But I continue to be concerned, and I think that one of the concerns is, and I talked about verbal food fights that you see on Fox or MSNBC and even sometimes CNN. The point of view journalism, especially on cable news, has become, standard operating procedure. It's the way they draw an audience. It's the way they drum up a crowd. It's the way they enrage a crowd. It's I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And it has come true tenfold. What goes on those channels, in my opinion, is not that enlightening, but it has been self-perpetuating, and it is a way for them to get an audience and to sell ads. I don't think it is the best use of their time or the best use of their resources, but it's cheaper to produce a fight on TV than it is to send a reporter to Iraq or Africa or Venezuela, and it's better to make money, but we're not any more enlightened as a result of it. So I'm concerned about that trend. I'm also concerned about the trend when we talk about anonymity, and you have your own interesting story about that, which maybe you'll share a little with us. But I think as a reporter, we still are required. Lawyers read what we write and say, especially if it's an investigation, and they carefully examine whether or not we've done something we shouldn't do or stepped over the line. There is no one to follow the anonymous comments that are written on websites all over the country every day that say the most outrageous things, that print lies. The Tennessean went to Facebook so that they hoped that they could identify the people who were saying them, but even you can fake a Facebook page or a Twitter feed. I mean, I think this is the disturbing part of journalism that's had a huge impact on our politics. I think it's spurred a bigger divide in our country than ever before. And in part, it's because people can say the nastiest, most horrible, hateful things about people that they never would have gotten away with before. And they can do it in the cloak of darkness. They don't say it. They don't have to put their name on it. They can be any character they want and play any character they want. And I want people to be able to freely speak in this country and say whatever they want to and say it, but I don't think they should be able to do it in that way. So Wikipedia was one of those instances for you.
That's right.
I was Googling myself in New York. I was working at NBC, and I was Googling my name, and then suddenly Wikipedia came up, and it had this thing for Dad that explained who he was, and it was like 3 lines, and I didn't know who put it in there. I didn't put it in there. I know he didn't put it in there. And it said he was a publisher of the Tennessean, a founder of the First Amendment Center, and then it said something like, and he was believed to be, he lived in Russia for 4 years in the 70s, and he's believed to be involved in the assassination of Robert and John Kennedy. I laughed. He didn't laugh. He was mad about it.
I was mad about it. I was particularly mad about it, I'll tell you the truth, because I was not the only John Seigenthaler in the world. And I talked to him about it after an old friend, many of you know knew Victor Johnson during his lifetime, and he's the first person I knew that discovered it before you did. Mm-hmm. And he called me on the phone and said, Google yourself and hit the Wikipedia link and sue. And and I said, what is it, Vic? And he said, well, somebody's saying some scurrilous things about you. And so I read it and laughed, and then I get the call from him. And he said, don't laugh, you're not the only John Seigenthaler in the world, and I'm one, and we've got a grandson. You've got a grandson who's Jack Seigenthaler, whose name is John. And so I called Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia, and said, Miss Wales, you don't know me, but if you'd Google me and hit the Wikipedia link, I won't sue you. And so he did, and he said, oh, I'll take that down right now, and I'll put it in our archives so only 1,100 of our editors can read it. And I said, well, I don't want 1,100 people reading this. There's nothing to it. He said, we believe in intellectual democracy, and that includes the right to anonymity. I don't know who did it, but it's there, and putting it in the archives the best I could do. You know, there was a lot of heat in the 6 months that followed. I then wrote an article condemning Wikipedia for it, and he changed the rules some. And he and I have since had a meeting, confrontation. I'll tell you something about your mother I haven't told you. I had an hour to attack Jimmy Wales, and he had an hour to defend himself and counterattack. And we went to lunch. And then Al Gore was going to interview the two of us for another hour. It was a 3-hour program plus lunch. And we're sitting at lunch. We're at a table, and poor Jimmy is across the room at another table. And I'm getting ready to go to the bathroom. And I said to your mother, do not do what you're getting ready to do. Do not attack Jimmy Wales. You're so silly, I wouldn't do that. So I go to John, and I'm coming out, and she is all over him. And I said, Dolores, I told you not to do that. She said, look at him, smile. It's not funny, Mr. Wales. It's not funny. You don't know what he's been through. I haven't been through anything. But I'd have to say that as I look at old journalism and new journalism, I think the old values of accuracy and balance and, when possible, depth, I think those values must apply to the new journalism if there's going to be a credibility and accountability. And I base it not just on what happened to me at Wikipedia, but after I finally wrote an article on it in USA Today, I was flooded with responses. About half the people themselves had been victimized in much the same way, not just on Wikipedia, but somewhere else online. And there is now a whole body of law that really gives sort of support to that. Now, I don't deny that that the First Amendment protects anonymous speech. I mean, the founders and the pamphleteers quite often were anonymous. But I do think that the values that were instilled in journalism during my years there really obtained today, and we need that. We need that credibility and accountability if the new journalism online is going to provide the same sort of service that journalism historically provided.
It struck me also when you're talking about institutions and covering institutions, how important it is to have journalists and newspapers play that role. And I had a chance to interview Jill Abramson of the New York Times, executive editor of the New York Times, a while ago, and talked to her about a lot of the things that have happened over the last couple of years. And I asked her to compare the Obama administration to the other administrations that she'd covered going back decades. And when it came to openness and accountability, and she said it is the most secretive, most closed administration ever that I've ever covered. Clearly, I think that as over the last 20 years, it's interesting to watch. I mean, I think we expect more. I also think that governments are closing the ranks around the information that they can control and don't want out there. But it was a reminder to me of the importance of a New York Times or a Tennessean or an Jazeera America or CNN to be there to ask the tough questions, to push government leaders beyond where they're willing to go, and to find out the things that they don't want to tell us that will help us make up our minds about who leads our country and what policies that we should implement. I mean, I really do believe that that's the role of journalism. We're not going to talk all this time, so we want you to stand up and ask some questions, and we've talked almost 30 minutes here. But before we do that, so think about what you might want to ask. I want to, Dad doesn't talk about this very much, but recently there's been a move to name a bridge after him in downtown Nashville. And you know, the interesting thing about this is that there's a picture on the wall of our house. It's been up since I was young, of my father in a police station. Well, of my father with his leg over the railing of a bridge and a guy sitting on a pipe. And I can remember asking about that as a kid and saying, what was that? And it is the bridge that we're talking about, is the bridge where he went to cover the story of a man who's about to kill himself and jump off the bridge. Maybe you could fill us in how that happened.
Well, you just told it. I mean, you just scooped me.
I've done that before.
And I never liked it either. No, the poor fellow was down on his luck. He'd been a few moments, a half hour or so before that, his family had rejected him by refusing to accept a telephone call, reverse the charges. He was drinking and despondent. And
You were how old?
I was 26 maybe. And so they sent me, they said he was there, and they rushed me down there. I drove down with a photographer, Tom McGee, a colleague of Jack and Frank and Jim. And when I got there, Gene Bradford Williams there was a pipe, I guess and it ran the span of the Shelby Street Bridge, now the walking bridge. And he had crawled over it and was sitting on it, and his feet were on a guy wire under it. And he had told the police that he had called the paper and that he was going to do this, and he wanted to embarrass his family if he could. And as I say, he was a little drunk, and which was pretty dangerous for him. But I had my leg locked into the grill on that Sparkman Street Bridge, Shelby Street Bridge now. I guess soon to be the Shelby Sparkman Street Bridge. But it was a strange interview, you know. You're sitting there, and you never met the guy before. Hello, I'm John Seigenthaler from Tennessean. What's your name? And no, you can't take notes. You got to remember it in your mind. And Tom McGee and Bill Preston, who were the photographers who were there from the Tennessean, the big crowd had gathered by the time we got there, and the cops had been told, and there were I'd say a half dozen police officers, and they were big guys. John Mullane was a giant, and people had gathered around, were pressing in, and the police officer was so glad to see me. He said, "He's been waiting for you." So I climb up on the bridge, lock my right leg into the grill work, and I'm not worried. I'm not going over, I know. And I began this interview, and it was just a sad story, you know. He'd been rejected, and I began to try to talk him out of it. And it was interesting. Suddenly, a minister was kneeling at my foot and was praying. And that really set him off, and he stood up on the guy wire and said, "I don't want to hear any of that. I don't want to hear any of that. I don't believe in God anymore." And so the officers removed this well-meaning preacher, and I went on with the conversation. And then after maybe 20 minutes, boats began to gather below, and he saw him, stood up on the guy wire. He was wearing a flannel shirt, open at the collar, and he had on a wool knit tie. And I had a chance to observe that while I was talking, and I'm listening to the two photographers tell the police, if John gets a chance, you better be ready, because he'll go for him. I'm not sure I would have gone for him, except they put the idea in my mind, and I'm thinking, I know I'm not going to go in. My question is whether I'm strong enough to lift him, and I'm looking at how big he is, and he weighs 150 pounds, I guess. And suddenly these boats are down there, and he says, I'm going. And he stood up on the guy wire, and I grabbed and got him behind his collar, and they got me. And we both came over. And they held me up, but he sprawled on the sidewalk, feet in the gutter, and I looked up at me and said, I'll never forgive you. But within a week, he was in Central State, wrote me a letter, and took it back. And
every year after, we would get a Christmas card from Gene Bradford Williams thanking Dad for
that's right.
saving
And
his life.
we corresponded until he died in a Chicago nursing home. And so I don't know how Mayor Dean found out about this, but not long ago, Dolores would know. The mayor called and said, I want to take you to dinner. And we went to dinner, and he said, we're going to name the bridge for you. And I said, you what? I don't know how, I guess it triggered somebody's mind. I just have no idea, but it's really a great honor. And I don't know what Mr. Shelby's family is going to say. I don't know what John Shelby's family is going to say about it. I know your son, my grandson, called and said they're going to name the bridge for us. I said, yeah, Jack, that's right. And he said, can they spell it? And I don't know.
So I think that's a good point to invite your questions. Please stand up, and you've got a microphone so we can hear you.
There's one way in.
Don't be shy.
Sure.
I'll shout it out.
Shout it out.
So my name is George Hill. I work in the medical school, and we were talking before the session, but I've known Mr. Seigenthaler a long time. I really always admired your dad
Thank you.
and mom. We were talking
Thank
about
you.
some of his initiatives when it comes to, when it came to advancing equality here in Nashville, something that we'll all never, ever forget. And we thank you for it. So my question actually deals with the press. And in the last two and a half weeks, there's been a lot of discussion, unfortunately, about the Malaysian flight that was lost. And today, they acknowledged that it was lost. And my question is, I watch the news a lot and on TV, and I just wonder what your thoughts were with regards to the amount of reporting that was done on really very, very little information. And is that driven by ratings? Is it driven by we need to be first? But it just seemed like there was very, very little information, and some networks didn't do much, if anything, just reported the incident. But others would on and on and on forever. I mean, what are your thoughts about that? Or are we just observing it incorrectly, and that it's important to report news in quotations?
Well, I'll let him. We were talking about the very thing on the way down on the plane this morning. I think we both agreed that that CNN did it wall to wall, and there was never a new story. Yes, we thought we saw some debris, and it might be, or maybe there's a shadow beneath the surface. There was never a new lead, but there was a new story with nothing new in it. And go ahead.
Well, I don't. I am not entirely pure on this issue. I mean, I have to say, this is a news story. I mean, a jetliner went down. 777 went down and went missing, and there were a lot of questions. And it's a story we covered. We covered it, I thought we covered it well, and when it happened and when there were big announcements, we spent more time on it. But I was trying to remember the last time, other than a war or a major, 9/11 or something like that, that this happened. And the last time I remember it was Monica Lewinsky. I mean, I can't, and we went wall to wall with Monica Lewinsky for 3 months on MSNBC. Sadly, we did. Look, I don't know why CNN is doing it. I mean, I think that CNN, I've heard CNN argue that there are plenty of people interested and there are plenty of people who are watching who want every tidbit of information, and every time there was a tidbit of information, they reported it. And then they went for 24 hours more and continued on that story. There are a lot of other stories going on in the world that are very important right now. And what's going on in Ukraine, I think, could be critical to world peace or war. And that was going on simultaneously with the search for the plane in which there was no new information. What's going on in Venezuela could affect the United States as well. There are plenty of stories going on all over the world that I think need to be covered, and I'll tell you that I am proud of the network that I'm working for now, because we cover those stories. That does not mean we don't cover that plane. We covered the plane too. But I think it's a mistake to cover this story to the exclusion of all others when there really are some important stories going on. But look, this happened with John Benet Ramsey. This happened with, you pick, there are lots of stories like this that have captured the imagination of the country that people tune into, and the ratings do go up. The ratings do go up, and they go up substantially. And what happens with cable news is they keep beating that story until people don't watch anymore, and when they quit watching, they back off on that story and they pick up on something else. That's part of the way the business works. Ratings produce revenue, help them produce revenue, and they're making decisions based on news and business, I think. I think they'd have to answer for that. But all the cable news channels did that. So that's generally my feeling about it. Yes.
As a historian, I'd sort of like to ask the question, you mentioned about the polarization of the society as it's reflected and maybe exacerbated by cable news and the 24/7. But I'm wondering, is it that different from the polarization that your father saw, which was as intense
It might have been.
degrees? I'm wondering if the two of you have compared that nature of the divisions in society that both of you have seen, and how you would address that.
Go ahead.
Well, I do think that the polarization you're talking about during my time, it divided the southern states sharply and painfully, and I would be less than honest if I didn't say that that we didn't feel some pain from it. To look out the window and see pickets walking out front, and to read the day's mail and find out attacks and letters to the editor, and beyond that, subscription cancellations, because significant population in our city, we don't like to think about it, but a significant segment of this population was hostile to change. And we were in very stiff competition with an afternoon paper across the hall, across the board, disagreed with change and what we thought was progress. And it pervaded not just this community, but every major community in the South. And I look back on that time and think about it. And he would tell you that The editorials sometimes brought police officers into our basement and a police car out front, more than once. More than once, and it was a tough time, and you didn't worry about the cancellations because you know people need news, and we get over this, and 3 weeks later they're back. But it was also a violent time, and he might not want me to tell this, but I'm going to tell it anyway. There came a time after he was on television when I got another call from Don Aaron, by that time was handling public relations for police department, and Don had been a good reporter, and he said, "We're sending the police out to guard you. There are two brothers who have contacted us, and they have a third brother, and the third brother wants to do you harm, so we're going to protect you." I was not the person they were looking for. He was. And I don't know that I thought about it until after Don, but we talked that night and made sure that he had protection as well. But, you know, that's a long time gone, but those fellows, this was maybe a decade after. He was already in television by that time. And that's what it was.
This was their response to Timothy McVeigh and the federal bombing in Oklahoma City, and racist point of view happened to pick me out of TV and decided that they were going to do something to us. So it does come with the territory, as I learned as the child of John Seigenthaler. But I would go back to your question about division. Look, there have been many times in this country where the country has been divided. I was talking to a political science professor at Duke about this 2 or 3 months ago, in which they cite some historic measurement that suggests that we are at a point in this country where we haven't been before, and where we're much more divided. But I mean, clearly the country has been divided in many, many ways, and violently divided. All I think is, but what I think now that has changed that is that at least if the people who were there's a great documentary about the sit-ins in Nashville, in which NBC did, and Chet Huntley narrated, in which Diane Nash and John Lewis and many of the people who were part of the sit-in movement, they are chronicled through their sit-ins, and the horrible things that people were willing to say, full front face on camera. Well, I know who those people, I know who those people are because I know their face, and they can't hide. But it's today the people who can say those horrible things, and those hate-filled websites that have sprouted up all over the country in ways. It's not just the South, they're everywhere. And I think that's the difference, and that's what worries me the most. And I think people feel as if they have this permission to do it because they're not going to get in any trouble, and nobody will know who they are. But boy, they can say the worst stuff. So that's the difference that I see.
Which brings me back to say once more that the new journalism must cleave to old values of accuracy, balance, and depth.
So I'm struck by the context of tonight. We're at a great university, and I'm lucky as a humanities professor to get to teach some extraordinary students. And I've thought over the years what my job is as somebody who teaches the liberal arts. It's patience with nuance, so that students not only look for nuance, they live in nuance, and they start to understand that that's where reasonable societies move forward, right? So one of the things that I'm wondering is how then can what we do in great universities make a difference to help maybe offset these very things that I agree with, that are problematic, the shouting heads back and forth, and what can we do as college professors for our students who may not go into journalism, right? We are priming students to be able to make a difference, and from your perspectives as great journalists, what would you tell us that we can do to help prep them?
Well, I think one thing you can do is demand that research that's done gets a second source.
And it's not Wikipedia.
And yeah. But you know, Wikipedia is loaded with good information. Jimmy Wales will tell you that compare him with Encyclopedia Britannica, and he is 49% as accurate as Encyclopedia Britannica. But of course, there's been a study done since then that showed that that 49% may have been plagiarized from Encyclopedia Britannica, which doesn't make it that credible after all. I think that the decision that many high school teachers are making, and Jack tells me, my teachers won't let us use Wikipedia. And I think there are many college professors who feel the same way about it. And I just think that there is enough enough inaccuracy online, as you say, so that you must be careful, and particularly researchers must be certain that sources online are documented. And I don't know any other way except to say there's got to be a secondary source and sometimes a tertiary source.
I often hear from young people that, well, that information that's in the encyclopedia, there are lots of mistakes in that as well. I think that the conversation about fairness, accuracy, and accountability is a worthwhile conversation to have with young people today. What's real news? What's fake news? For example, I had the pleasure of being on or maybe not pleasure, of being on Stephen Colbert's program.
It was terrific.
To talk about Al Jazeera, but fake news has taken the place of real news. I believe Stephen and John Stewart would say that despite their influence and their great ability to convey some powerful messages to young people and to our society, that it's not their job, that it's our job. And in fact, they've said that many times. They're just beginning to scratch the surface on the news, and we should be able to take that much further along. I believe that whether it's the newspaper or television news or the history book that they read or the sources that they find online, fairness, accuracy, and accountability is an important message to in a generation that has grown up on the internet with all the information at their hand. And the real question is whether they're able to sort through and sift through that information and find what's real and find what's not. And that's the challenge that we have today. When I was growing up, when I was younger, and when I was in college, we pretty much were told this is the way it is. These students can look beyond and find out whether that's really true. And that's great if they have those critical skills. But I'm not sure, it's moved, the technology's moved so fast, and the changes take place so quickly, and the what's real and what's not real continues, in my opinion, to be a problem.
And that whole
I think people like you can help.
And the whole opportunity for not just young people, but for old people, the opportunity to say anything you want to say with anonymity is the thing that makes it so dangerous, I think, in communicating information. I can remember the conversation with Jimmy Wales. Well, there came a moment when I said, well, look, so you've taken it down. Tell me this, who in the hell did this? And he said, sir, I don't have any idea. But you can find out. All you have to do is file a John Doe or a Jane Doe lawsuit against the information service provider. I can give you the IP number. I said, I've got the IP number. I know it's Bell South. I don't want to sue anybody. I mean, I founded the First Amendment Center at Vanderbilt. Why do I want to sue somebody for saying something bad about me? But I damn well want to know who did it, and I want to confront him, and can't you help me? And I said, if it were in the Tennessean, I could tell you who said it about you, because I make those letters. If you write a letter to the editor, you're going to sign your name to it. And he said, I'm sorry, that's not our form of democracy. And so I went hunting, and it took me 7 months and an article in USA Today condemning Wikipedia to finally, one day, the poor fellow walks in off the street and leaves me a letter of confession. And it was just before Christmas. And I called him on the phone to give him hell. And he started weeping a little bit and said, you know, I lost my job today. And Jack Seigenthaler's grandmother is listening on the phone, and she starts weeping. They fired him. You got to call him and tell him they got to take him back. It's just before Christmas. Which she made me do.
Well, you've listened to us for an hour. I want to say I'm so happy to be with my father, whom I love very much, and proud to be with him before you today. Thank you very much.
I want to add my thanks to your coming, your being with us for this very special evening. I'm going to do a couple of just shameless plugs. One is the Colbert Report, the interview with the gentleman here. If you missed it, it's on YouTube. It's really worth catching. He more than holds his own, which doesn't always happen. More than holds his own. And it was one of the more disappointing performances by Stephen, I thought. But that's my review. And I want to also mention that Thursday we're going to have a wonderful panel that the other gentleman will be here moderating with author Ann Patchett and with artist and printmaker Barry Moser, called For the Love of Books. And I think someone's surprised by that. Not sure. But I also want to mention an upcoming exhibit that will be in the libraries, especially for those of you who are interested in this program. The lobby exhibit will, in the next couple of months, become one that showcases rights and freedoms, including freedom of the press, freedom of speech, civil rights, gay rights, women's rights, and I think you'll enjoy it. And the gallery exhibit outside of Special Collections will feature two of our beloved sports writers, Grantland Rice and Fred Russell. And those will all be up in the coming weeks. So we hope you'll come back to visit us often. I'm not sure we can guarantee a night like this. This one is really special. And will you help me thank them again for their work?
Thank you very much.